The podcast Echoes of the Unheard began as a modest experiment, an outlet for Lydia Lane's lifelong fascination with the eerie and unexplained. In the early days, she recorded in her small apartment, surrounded by blankets hung on the walls to absorb sound, her microphone perched precariously on a stack of books. What started as a hobby quickly became a phenomenon. Within a year, Echoes of the Unheard climbed the charts, drawing millions of listeners eager to hear Lydia's deep, resonant voice weave tales of urban legends, true crime, and mysteries long forgotten. Lydia had a gift. Her storytelling made even the most skeptical listeners second-guess their certainty. Her voice had an almost hypnotic quality, calm yet commanding, as if each word carried a weight far beyond its meaning. Fans adored her, filling online forums with theories about her episodes and speculations about her personal life. But for Lydia, the show was a double-edged sword. The more successful she became, the more she felt like a shadow was creeping at the edge of her life. Something intangible, yet suffocating. Her latest episode, The Vanishing of Victor Greaves, epitomized her rise to fame. The story revolved around a man who disappeared in 1993 while driving home from work. His car was found abandoned on a rural road, the keys still in the ignition, the driver's seatbelt unbuckled. Witnesses claimed to have seen Victor walking into the nearby woods, but search parties never found him. Over the years, local lore turned his disappearance into a ghost story, with countless reports of spectral figures appearing on that same road. The episode went viral almost immediately. Lydia's deep dive into the case included interviews with Victor's grieving sister, audio clips from local news reports, and chilling recordings of supposed encounters with Victor's ghost. The podcast forums buzzed with activity, listeners sharing their own theories and tales of the paranormal. For Lydia, the response was exhilarating, until a strange email landed in her inbox. The subject line read, "You've heard me before." The body of the email was brief. "Stop searching. You're closer than you think." Attached was an old, grainy photograph of a man standing beside a rusted car. It was Victor Greaves, but the details in the image were unsettling. His expression was blank, his eyes seemed to look past the camera, and his left hand was blurred, as if it were moving. Lydia brushed it off at first. The podcast's success had brought its share of trolls and overzealous fans. But as she studied the email again, something about the photograph gnawed at her. The rusted car in the picture wasn't the one Victor had disappeared in. In fact, Lydia couldn't recall seeing that car in any of her research. When she tried to reverse search the image, nothing came up, as though it didn't exist online. The email unsettled her in a way she couldn't articulate. That night, as she lay in bed, the quiet hum of her apartment felt unusually oppressive. The air seemed thicker, the shadows deeper. Sleep didn't come easily. When it finally did, she dreamt of static, the kind that hisses from old televisions late at night. In the dream, she was speaking into her microphone, but the words she spoke were incomprehensible. In the distance, a faint voice answered back, its tone pleading. She woke in a cold sweat, her heart racing. The next morning, she checked her email inbox again, half expecting another cryptic message. But there was nothing new. Still, the unease lingered. She decided to do what she always did when something unsettled her, turn it into an episode. Lydia began drafting a follow-up on the Victor Greaves case. She reasoned that revisiting the mystery might reveal the source of her discomfort, or at least distract her from it. During the recording, everything went smoothly at first. Her voice was steady, her research meticulous, and her delivery compelling. Yet as she edited the audio that evening, she noticed something strange. In one segment, between her sentences, there was a faint sound. At first, she thought it was interference, maybe a neighbor's television or her computer fan. But as she replayed it, the sound grew clearer. It was a voice, faint but unmistakable. It was saying her name. Lydia froze, her hand hovering over the pause button. Her first instinct was to delete the segment entirely, but curiosity overruled fear. She isolated the audio, amplifying it until the voice became clearer. It was soft and slow, as if spoken through clenched teeth. "Lydia, don't." She leaned back in her chair, the air in the room feeling heavy. For the first time since starting the podcast, Lydia considered the possibility that her investigations might be drawing attention from something far beyond her audience. Lydia couldn't stop thinking about the voice. By the time the sun rose the next morning, she had replayed the audio clip at least 20 times, each pass chilling her further. The voice wasn't just eerie, it felt personal. There was something about the way it said her name that made her chest tighten, as though the speaker knew her, as though they had been waiting to say those words for a long time. Her logical mind offered plenty of explanations. Audio interference was common, especially with the aging equipment she sometimes relied on. Maybe it was a quirk of her recording software, an accidental overlap with another sound file. But those explanations rang hollow. She couldn't shake the sensation that the voice wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. Lydia decided to take a break from editing and went for a walk. The streets of her neighborhood were quiet, the kind of calm she usually found comforting. But today, the stillness made her skin crawl. Even the birds seemed subdued, their chirping faint and irregular. She walked faster than usual, as if trying to outpace the anxiety building inside her. When she returned home, she opened her email inbox, almost dreading what she might find. To her surprise, it was empty, save for the usual flood of fan mail and collaboration requests. One subject line caught her eye: "Loved the Victor Grease episode." It was from a listener named Thomas Greer. His email was enthusiastic, filled with praise for her storytelling and attention to detail. But at the end, he added something peculiar. "One thing, though, did you mean to include the whispering? Gave me chills, but it was genius if intentional. Great atmosphere." Lydia stared at the message, her hands trembling slightly as she reread it. So the whispering wasn't just in her head. Someone else had heard it. She replied quickly, her words carefully composed to mask her unease. "Thanks for listening, Thomas. Can you tell me exactly where you heard the whispering? I want to make sure it fits the tone of the episode." Minutes later, Thomas replied, describing the same segment Lydia had listened to over and over. His email ended with a sentence that made her stomach drop. "It sounded like someone was standing right behind you. Totally creepy. Perfect for your show." Lydia's apartment suddenly felt too small, the walls too close. She checked the locks on her doors and windows. Irrationally hoping to bar the presence, she was beginning to feel more and more. She told herself it was paranoia, her imagination heightened by the unsettling nature of her work. But deep down, she didn't believe that. Later that evening, Lydia decided to listen to her older episodes. She had never noticed anything unusual in her recordings before, but now she felt compelled to check. She started with the first episode she ever recorded back when the podcast was just a side project. It was a story about a haunted motel in New Mexico, an episode she remembered fondly for its simplicity. Halfway through, she heard it again, a whisper, faint but distinct, embedded in the background. This time, it wasn't her name. The voice said, "You shouldn't have started." Lydia's heart raced as she paused the audio. She scrolled through the episode's waveform, hunting for visual signs of interference, but everything looked normal. It was impossible. She hadn't edited anything into that episode. It was her first, and she had barely known how to use her software back then. She played another episode, one from 6 months later. The voice was there, too, this time saying, "It's too late." By the third episode, Lydia stopped listening. Her chest felt tight, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The voice hadn't been a fluke. It wasn't new. Whatever this was, it had been with her from the beginning. It had been waiting for her to notice. For the first time in her podcasting career, Lydia questioned whether she had made a terrible mistake. She had always thought her work shined a light on forgotten stories, giving voice to the silent and unseen. But what if, in doing so, she had invited something into her life, something that couldn't be silenced? The morning after discovering the whispers, Lydia avoided her recording equipment altogether. She couldn't bring herself to touch the microphone or open her editing software. It felt like acknowledging their presence would give them power. Instead, she busied herself with menial tasks, scrubbing her kitchen counters, rearranging bookshelves, and folding laundry she'd ignored for weeks. But the house felt wrong, its familiar corners now harboring a quiet menace. As the day wore on, her phone buzzed with notifications. Fans were reacting to her latest episode with their usual enthusiasm, speculating about Victor Greaves, sharing ghost stories, and more disturbingly, debating the whispers. Some praised them as an immersive touch, while others joked that they sounded too real to be fake. One comment stopped her cold. Does anyone else think the whispers are responding to her? Like they're not random. They're talking to her? Lydia slammed her laptop shut, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had thought she could control the narrative, but the whispers were slipping through her grasp, weaving their way into her audience's reality. And what scared her most was that the commenter might be right. As evening fell, Lydia received a phone call from a blocked number. She hesitated before answering, half expecting to hear static or another voice from the void. Instead, an excited young man's voice greeted her. "Lydia Lane. Wow, I can't believe I'm actually talking to you," he said, his words tumbling out in a nervous rush. "My name's Ethan, and I'm a huge fan of Echoes of the Unheard. I hope this isn't weird, but I had to reach out about the Victor Greaves episode." Lydia forced herself to sound composed. "Hi, Ethan. Thanks for listening. What's on your mind?" "Well, I live about 20 minutes from where Victor disappeared. My family's been in the area forever, and there's this old story my grandfather used to tell. He swore Victor didn't just vanish, he was taken. He said Victor started hearing voices before he disappeared, like they were calling him somewhere. I always thought it was just a campfire tale, you know? But after your episode, I don't know. It gave me chills." Lydia's throat tightened. She kept her voice steady. "That's really interesting, Ethan. Did your grandfather ever say where Victor was taken?" "Yeah, he said the voices lured him into the woods near an old abandoned factory. My grandpa used to warn us kids not to go there. He said once you heard the voices, you couldn't resist them." Ethan paused. "Do you think the whispers in your episode could be like that? Like connected somehow?" Lydia froze. She hadn't mentioned the whispers outside of her fans' comments, and certainly not on the podcast itself. "Ethan, did you say you heard whispers?" "Yeah, didn't everyone? They were faint, but they sounded so real. It was genius. I've been listening to your episodes since the beginning, and I swear they've been in a few of your older ones too. It's like they're part of your signature now." Lydia's stomach churned. She ended the call politely, but her hands were trembling as she hung up. Ethan's words confirmed her worst fear. The whispers weren't just an anomaly in her most recent episode. They had been present all along, unnoticed by her until now. That night, Lydia dreamt again of the static. This time, she was walking through a forest, her microphone clutched tightly in her hands. The woods were alive with whispers, their words incomprehensible but insistent, like a tide that refused to retreat. Her footsteps grew heavier as she moved deeper into the trees, until finally, she reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a crumbling factory, its windows shattered, its metal frame coated in rust. The whispers grew louder, converging into a single phrase. "Come closer." Lydia's hand shook as she raised her microphone. She opened her mouth to respond, but woke up before she could speak. The dream left her drenched in sweat, her sheets tangled around her legs. The clearing, the factory, the whispers, it all felt too vivid, too specific to be coincidence. She turned on her bedside lamp, determined not to let the darkness overwhelm her. The email from a few days ago flashed in her mind. "You're closer than you think." The words suddenly took on a sinister clarity. What if the factory in her dream was real? What if the whispers were trying to lead her there? For the first time since starting Echoes of the Unheard, Lydia felt like her role as an observer had ended. She wasn't just telling someone else's story anymore. She was part of it. Lydia spent the morning pacing her apartment, clutching a mug of cold coffee she'd forgotten to drink. The dream from the night before lingered like a heavy fog, refusing to dissipate even in the sharp light of day. She tried to push the memory of the crumbling factory out of her mind, but its image remained vivid. The jagged glass, the rust-streaked walls, and the oppressive feeling of being watched by something unseen. By midday, her resolve crumbled. Sitting down at her desk, she opened her laptop and searched for factories near the area where Victor Greaves had disappeared. A list of sites popped up, most of them either demolished or repurposed into modern spaces. But one stood out, a derelict factory deep in the woods, abandoned decades ago after a mysterious explosion. Its history was patchy at best, but the locals had nicknamed it the Echo Plant, a chilling coincidence given the title of Lydia's podcast. Her pulse quickened. The Echo Plant matched the factory in her dream almost perfectly. She told herself it was nothing but a bizarre coincidence. But deep down, she didn't believe that anymore. The whispers, the dreams, the strange voices in her episodes, they all pointed here. Lydia debated what to do next. Her instincts screamed at her to leave it alone, to ignore the whispers and carry on with her life. But she knew that wasn't an option. Her podcast was built on uncovering the hidden, the forgotten, the unexplained. If she didn't investigate this, she'd never forgive herself. Or worse, the whispers might not let her walk away. She grabbed her portable recording kit, stuffed it into a bag, and headed for her car. The drive to the factory was long and winding, the narrow roads flanked by dense trees that seemed to close in around her the further she went. Her GPS signal faded halfway there, leaving her to rely on hastily scribbled directions she had copied down from an old forum. When she finally reached the overgrown path leading to the factory, a wave of unease washed over her. The clearing from her dreams stretched out before her, eerily identical. The factory loomed in the distance, its skeletal structure silhouetted against the gray sky. Lydia parked her car at the edge of the clearing and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as she tried to steady her breathing. The air felt heavy as she stepped out of the car, her equipment bag slung over her shoulder. Every sound, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant rustle of branches, seemed amplified, as though the forest itself were alive and listening. She thought she heard faint whispers in the distance, but every time she stopped to listen, they vanished. The factory was in worse condition up close. Its doors hung on broken hinges, and graffiti covered the walls, though most of it was faded and illegible. Lydia hesitated at the entrance, the whispers growing louder in her mind, urging her forward. She pulled out her microphone and began recording, narrating her thoughts in an effort to calm herself. "This is Lydia Lane," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've arrived at what locals call the Echo Plant, an abandoned factory tied to strange rumors and a tragic history. I'll be documenting my findings here as I explore the site." The words felt hollow, forced. She knew she wasn't here for a standard episode. This wasn't just a story. It was something darker, something personal. Inside the factory, the air was thick with the smell of rust and decay. Broken machinery lay scattered across the floor, and shards of glass crunched under her boots. She wandered through the cavernous space, her flashlight beam slicing through the shadows. Occasionally, she stopped to record ambient sounds, the dripping of water from the ceiling, the faint whistle of wind through the cracks. As she approached the center of the factory, her microphone picked up something strange, a low hum, barely audible. She adjusted the gain, her heart racing as the sound grew louder. It wasn't mechanical. It was a voice, faint and rhythmic, whispering in a language she didn't recognize. Lydia froze, her hands trembling as she gripped the microphone. The voice wasn't coming from the recording. It was in the room with her. She turned slowly, her flashlight sweeping across the space. At first, she saw nothing but shadows. But then, in the far corner of the factory, a figure emerged. It was indistinct, like a smudge on an old photograph, its edges flickering in and out of focus. But its eyes, two pinpoints of light, were fixed on her. Lydia's breath caught in her throat as the whispers swelled, filling the room with an unbearable noise. Dropping the microphone, she stumbled backward, her flashlight clattering to the floor. The figure didn't move, but the whispers grew louder, sharper, until they coalesced into a single, chilling phrase. "You found us?" Lydia turned and ran, her heart pounding as she fled the factory and burst into the clearing. She didn't stop until she reached her car, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. The whispers followed her, faint but relentless, even as she sped down the winding road back to civilization. When she finally made it home, Lydia collapsed onto her couch, her mind racing. She had found something beyond explanation, beyond reason. But the question burned in her mind. Had she found it? Or had it found her? Lydia awoke the next morning to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. Her heart leapt in her chest. She hadn't slept soundly in weeks, and this morning was no different. Her dreams had been jagged, filled with distorted echoes of her time at the Echo plant. Flickering figures, glowing eyes, and whispers that seemed to bleed into the waking world. As she fumbled for her phone, she noticed dozens of missed calls and texts from Hannah. She swiped to open the most recent message. It read, "Lydia, something's wrong with the podcast. Call me now." Her stomach churned as she quickly dialed back. Hannah picked up on the first ring, her voice taut and frantic. "Lydia, the latest upload. People are freaking out," Hannah blurted, barely pausing for breath. There's something on the episode that wasn't in the original file." Lydia frowned, trying to recall her final edits. "What do you mean?" "I listened to it before uploading. It was clean. What's wrong with it?" Hannah hesitated, then said, "You need to hear it for yourself." Lydia pulled up the episode, which had gone live at midnight. Its title, "The Whisper in the Dark," now felt prophetic in a way she didn't like. She hit play, and for the first few minutes, everything seemed fine. Her voice carried the usual mix of confidence and curiosity as she described her visit to the Echo plant. But then, just as she reached the part where she had heard the strange humming, the recording shifted. Her voice cut out entirely, replaced by static. At first, it was faint, but soon it grew louder, interspersed with distorted whispers. Lydia leaned in closer, straining to catch the words, but they were garbled, like voices speaking underwater. And then, clear as a bell, came a phrase she hadn't recorded. "We're not done yet, Lydia." Her blood ran cold. The voice wasn't hers, nor was it Hannah's. It was deep, rasping, and inhuman. The static continued for another 30 seconds before abruptly cutting back to her narration, as if nothing had happened. "This wasn't there before," Lydia said, her voice trembling. "Hannah, I swear to you, I didn't record this." "I know you didn't," Hannah replied. "But here's the thing. Listeners are reporting strange stuff happening after they hear that voice. One guy says his phone glitched out and started dialing random numbers. Another swears they saw shadows moving in their room while listening." And Lydia, Hannah paused, her voice barely above a whisper. Someone posted a comment saying they recognized the voice. Lydia's breath caught. Recognized it? How? They said it belonged to Victor Greaves. The room seemed to tilt around Lydia as the name hit her like a blow. Victor Greaves, the subject of her podcast's first viral episode. The man whose disappearance had launched her career. She had speculated on his fate, spun theories about his vanishing, but she had never believed she'd hear his voice again. Hannah continued, her words coming in a rush. "Lydia, this is way beyond weird. I think you need to pull the episode." "No," Lydia interrupted, her voice firmer than she felt. "If we pull it now, it'll only fuel the hysteria. Let me look into this first. I need to figure out what's happening." Hannah sighed, but didn't argue. They ended the call, and Lydia sat in silence, staring at the waveform of the episode on her laptop. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of the past few weeks. The whispers, the dream, the figure in the factory, and now this voice, taunting her through her own work. She decided to dig deeper into the mystery of the Echo plant. Pulling up forums and local archives, she scoured every mention of the factory's history. What she found only deepened her unease. Decades ago, a fire had gutted the building, killing several workers. Witnesses had claimed to hear screams long after the flames were extinguished, describing the sound as echoes of the dead. The factory was abandoned soon after, and over the years, it became a breeding ground for urban legends. One story, however, stood out. It involved a group of teens who had ventured into the factory in the 1990s for a dare. They had reportedly heard whispers urging them to leave, but one boy refused to listen. He disappeared that night, and his friends later swore they had seen his face staring at them through a broken window, distorted, flickering, and not entirely human. Lydia shivered, the memory of the flickering figure in her dream flashing through her mind. She closed her laptop and glanced at her microphone, still lying where she had dropped it after returning from the factory. What if she had brought something back with her? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across her apartment. Lydia felt the weight of her next step pressing down on her. She had promised herself that she would investigate the Echo plant thoroughly, but now it felt less like a choice and more like a compulsion. The voice had said, "We're not done yet," and Lydia knew, deep down, that she wasn't done either. Lydia spent the rest of the night listening to the corrupted episode on repeat, searching for any hidden meaning in the static and the distorted voice. Each time she replayed the words, asterisk, "We're not done yet, Lydia," asterisk, her chest tightened, the sense of being watched growing unbearable. Every creak in her apartment, every shadow cast by a passing car outside, felt pregnant with malevolence. By morning, Lydia had made up her mind to revisit the Echo plant, convinced she had overlooked something critical during her first visit. But before she could leave, her phone buzzed with an incoming email. The subject line read, "It happened to me too." The sender, a man named Elliot Harper, claimed he had experienced something strange after listening to her latest episode. His message was erratic, jumping between thoughts, but one line stood out. "Whatever's in that factory doesn't want to be found. It's warning you." Lydia stared at the screen, a shiver running down her spine. She quickly typed a reply, asking Elliot if they could speak. His response came within minutes, providing his number and a request to call immediately. Lydia hesitated. She wasn't in the habit of speaking directly with listeners, but her curiosity overpowered her caution. Elliot's voice was gravelly and strained, as if he hadn't slept. "Lydia, you have no idea what you've stumbled into," he began, skipping pleasantries. "I've been researching the Echo plant for years. When I heard your episode, I thought you might be onto something, but that voice..." He trailed off, seemingly struggling to find the right words. "What about the voice?" Lydia pressed. "It's not just some random EVP," he said, referring to electronic voice phenomena. "It's intelligent. It knows things. When I listened to the episode last night, my laptop started glitching, files opening on their own, images flashing on the screen. But then it showed me something that made my blood run cold." "What did it show you?" Lydia asked, her heartbeat quickening. Elliot paused before answering. "A picture of you, standing in the factory. But here's the thing, I don't think it was from your visit. You were wearing different clothes, and there was someone else standing behind you. Someone tall, shadowy. I think it's been following you." Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. "That's impossible," she said, though her voice wavered. "Listen to me," Elliot continued, urgency creeping into his tone. "The Echo plant is more than a haunted building. It's like a living thing, feeding off the energy of anyone who enters. And it's been trying to reach people like us, people who are curious enough to dig too deep." The call left Lydia shaken, but she couldn't let it deter her. She decided to push forward, driven by equal parts fear and fascination. Before leaving her apartment, she grabbed a small recorder and a flashlight, preparing for her return to the factory. On her way out, she received another email, this time from a longtime listener. The subject line read simply, "Stop." The email was short but chilling. "You don't know what you're dealing with. If you go back, you won't come out the same." By the time Lydia reached the factory, the sky was overcast, casting the crumbling building in an eerie gray light. The entrance was exactly as she had left it, an old metal door, slightly ajar, inviting yet foreboding. She stepped inside, the air thick with damp and decay. As she moved deeper into the factory, her footsteps echoed unnervingly in the vast, empty space. She retraced her previous path to the room where she had first heard the strange humming. This time, however, the atmosphere felt heavier, as if the factory itself were aware of her return. She turned on her recorder and began speaking, her voice steady despite the gnawing anxiety in her chest. "I'm back at the Echo plant," she narrated. "The room feels different today, almost charged. I don't know if it's just my imagination or if something's truly changed." Suddenly, a loud clang echoed from somewhere deeper in the building, startling her into silence. She whipped around, shining her flashlight into the darkness. The beam caught nothing but rusted machinery and crumbling walls. "Hello," she called, her voice cracking. The air seemed to pulse in response, and then she heard it, a low, guttural whisper, unmistakably close. We told you to leave. Lydia froze, the recorder slipping from her fingers and clattering to the floor. She turned in a slow circle, her flashlight shaking as it cut through the gloom. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, coalescing into shapes that almost resembled faces. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure, impossibly tall and impossibly thin, standing just at the edge of her light. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Leave, Lydia." But she couldn't move, couldn't speak. She was rooted to the spot, her mind screaming with the realization that whatever this thing was, it wasn't a ghost. It was something far older, far darker. And it wasn't done with her yet. Lydia didn't remember how she left the factory. One moment, she was staring at the impossibly tall figure lurking at the edge of her light. The next, she was in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she tried to calm the rapid beating of her heart. The figure's image, its shadowy, elongated form, burned into her mind like an afterimage of staring into the sun. When she finally made it home, she locked the door behind her, triple-checking the deadbolt. For the first time, she contemplated abandoning the podcast altogether. This wasn't just a story anymore. It had turned into something dangerous, something alive. She sat at her desk and replayed the recording from the factory, hoping for clarity. The audio captured her narration, the clang that had startled her, and then the whisper, "We told you to leave." But it didn't stop there. A faint thumping noise followed, like footsteps dragging across the concrete. Then came a low, unearthly hum. It wasn't mechanical, like the hum she'd heard during her first visit. It was deeper, resonating like a growl from the throat of something immense. As Lydia listened, a cold realization dawned. The hum was increasing in volume, subtly at first but growing steadily louder. Panicked, she yanked out her headphones, but the sound didn't stop. It wasn't coming from her computer. It was in her apartment. She froze, her body tensed as her ears strained to locate the source. The hum seemed to seep from the walls, vibrating through the floor. It ebbed and flowed like breathing, punctuated by faint creaks that sounded eerily like footsteps. Summoning her courage, Lydia grabbed the flashlight from her bag and swept the beam across the dark corners of her apartment. Nothing. The hum subsided as quickly as it had started, leaving her in oppressive silence. But the unease lingered. Her apartment no longer felt like a safe haven. She left every light on that night, afraid of what the darkness might conceal. The next morning, Lydia woke to an email from Elliot. The subject line read, "You're not safe." His message was brief but alarming. "The thing in the factory isn't confined there. It's marked you. It knows where you are." Lydia's fingers hovered over her keyboard, unsure how to respond. Before she could type a reply, another email arrived. This one was from a different listener, a woman named Carol. Her message was even more cryptic. "Do you hear them yet? The footsteps? They come first." The word struck Lydia like a punch to the gut. She leaned back in her chair, the room spinning around her. The footsteps, the hum, the whispers. Was this all connected to the Echo plant? Or was something else at play? Lydia decided she needed answers, desperately. She spent the rest of the day diving into her research, revisiting old articles about the Echo plant. She unearthed a newspaper clipping about a series of disappearances in the 1980s. According to the article, factory workers had started vanishing without explanation, their belongings left behind as if they'd simply walked out mid-shift. One witness claimed to have seen a shadow-like figure roaming the factory floor at night, but the account was dismissed as hysteria. Lydia's chest tightened as she read on. The disappearances had stopped abruptly after the factory's closure, but the mystery remained unsolved. One particular line from the article chilled her. They called it the Watcher, always seen, never caught. That night, Lydia hesitated to record a new episode. Normally, she would have shared her findings immediately, but now she felt paralyzed by fear. Still, her loyal listeners were expecting something, and she didn't want to lose their trust. She set up her microphone, keeping her voice calm and measured as she described her second visit to the Echo plant and the strange events that had followed. As she spoke, She became increasingly aware of her surroundings. Every creak of her apartment, every distant car horn, seemed amplified. Her words faltered when she heard a soft thud, like a heavy footfall, just outside her closed bedroom door. Lydia froze, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it would be picked up by the mic. The thud came again, followed by another, each one closer than the last. Slowly, she turned off her recording equipment and grabbed her flashlight. The light flickered as she pointed it toward the door. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. There was no response, only silence. Then, as if in answer, the doorknob began to turn. The doorknob stopped turning, and for a brief moment, silence engulfed the room. Lydia's breath hitched as she clutched the flashlight, its dim beam illuminating the cracks in the door. She strained her ears, listening for any sign of movement on the other side. Her mind raced through possibilities. Was it an intruder? A neighbor? Or something worse? Summoning her courage, Lydia crept closer to the door, her bare feet muffled against the carpet. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear twisting in her chest. No answer. She placed her hand on the doorknob, hesitating before yanking it open. The hallway was empty, bathed in the faint glow of a distant street lamp streaming through her apartment window. Nothing was out of place, but the air felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Lydia stepped out cautiously, scanning every shadow with her flashlight. Her building was quiet, the kind of oppressive stillness that only existed in the dead of night. She checked the locks on her front door, ensuring they were secure, and returned to her bedroom, shutting the door firmly behind her. But as she sat back down at her desk, she noticed something odd. A faint line of black dust had gathered along the bottom of the doorframe. She knelt down, running her fingers through the powdery substance. It smelled faintly metallic, like scorched earth. Confused, Lydia grabbed her phone to snap a picture, but the screen flickered before she could press the button. A sharp crackle filled the room, followed by a faint voice. At first, she thought it was coming from her phone, but when she checked, the device was off. The voice grew louder, insistent yet incomprehensible, like someone whispering directly into her ear. She spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. Then, the whisper stopped, replaced by a single word that cut through the stillness. "Listen." Lydia's blood turned to ice. She stumbled back, knocking over her chair, and stared at her desk. The audio recording she'd been editing earlier was playing, though she was certain she had stopped it. The playback was garbled, a distorted mix of static and faint voices. But one phrase emerged clearly, sending a chill down her spine. "They're here." Panic surged through her as she fumbled to turn off the recording. Her fingers trembled, but the stop button wouldn't respond. The voices continued, growing louder and more urgent, until Lydia yanked the power cord from her computer. Silence returned, but it was far from comforting. She leaned against the wall, her chest heaving with rapid breaths. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself, trying to regain control. But deep down, she knew that everything she had dismissed as paranoia was far too deliberate to be a coincidence. Determined to make sense of it all, Lydia pulled up the email she had received from her listeners. She reread Elliot's cryptic warning and Carol's chilling message about footsteps. Something about the phrasing struck her differently now. What if they weren't warnings, but confirmations? What if her listeners had experienced the same thing she was going through? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound, a faint scratching noise, like nails dragging along a surface. It came from behind her bedroom wall. Lydia froze, gripping the edge of her desk, her eyes fixed on the source of the noise. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and then stopped abruptly. A new sound followed, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. The sound reverberated through the room, shaking her resolve. She didn't dare move, waiting for whatever would come next. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Lydia was left staring at the wall, the weight of dread settling heavily in her chest. She whispered a single question into the empty room, her voice barely audible. "Who's there?" The reply was immediate, chilling, and unmistakable. "You know?" Lydia didn't sleep that night. She sat motionless at her desk, her body rigid and her mind teetering between disbelief and terror. The whisper, echoed in her thoughts, as if the words were alive, crawling into the corners of her psyche. What did she know? She racked her brain, but the answer eluded her. The air in her apartment had turned oppressively thick, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the walls, which now felt less like a building and more like a living entity. By dawn, Lydia knew she couldn't stay in her apartment. She packed her essentials into a backpack. Her laptop, a portable recorder, a flashlight, and the microphone that had become both her lifeline and her curse. She called a friend, Claire, to ask if she could stay over for a few days. Claire agreed without hesitation, unaware of the weight of Lydia's request. The moment she stepped outside, the world felt sharper, the air crisper. It was as though she had escaped a suffocating pressure. She hurried to her car, her eyes darting to every shadow, her ears straining for the sound of footsteps. As she drove to Claire's, the radio turned itself on, blasting static at full volume. Lydia nearly veered off the road, fumbling to turn it off, but the dial wouldn't budge. And then through the static, she heard it again, the hum, low, resonant, and growing louder. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as she forced herself to keep driving. But as the hum intensified, it was joined by something new, faint, disjointed whispers. The voices layered over one another, rising and falling in a chaotic rhythm. Lydia slammed her fist against the radio, and the sound abruptly ceased. When she arrived at Claire's, she was visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she rang the doorbell. Claire opened the door, her face creased with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, ushering Lydia inside. "You have no idea," Lydia muttered, setting her bag down and collapsing onto the couch. She explained everything in bursts. The factory, the whispers, the emails, and the voice that had spoken to her from the walls. Claire listened, her expression shifting from skeptical to alarmed as Lydia recounted the events in painstaking detail. "Maybe it's stress," Claire offered hesitantly. "You've been pushing yourself too hard with the podcast." "It's not stress," Lydia snapped, her voice sharper than intended. She softened her tone, trying to explain. "This isn't in my head, Claire. There's someone following me. I don't know why, but it's real." Claire nodded reluctantly, though doubt lingered in her eyes. To distract herself, Lydia decided to check her email. She connected her laptop to Claire's Wi-Fi and opened her inbox. Another message from Elliot was waiting. This one more cryptic than the last. "You're close, but you're not listening. The static isn't noise. It's a map." Lydia stared at the screen, her mind racing. A map? She replayed the distorted recording from the factory on her laptop, this time slowing it down and amplifying certain frequencies. The static shifted, morphing into an uneven rhythm. Her heart pounded as she realized Elliot was right. The static wasn't random. It was structured, deliberate. She isolated a section of the audio and looped it, analyzing the pattern. It sounded like Morse code, though fragmented and uneven. Lydia scribbled down the sequence of beeps and pauses, translating it as best she could. The result was chilling. "Find the source." "What does that mean?" Claire asked, leaning over her shoulder. Lydia shook her head, her throat dry. "I don't know, but I think it's guiding me back to the factory." Claire's eyes widened in alarm. "You can't go back there. Not after everything that's happened." "I don't have a choice," Lydia replied, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her resolve. "Whatever this is, it won't stop. I have to know what's behind it." That night, as Claire slept, Lydia sat alone in the living room, the hum from her recording looping softly through her headphones. It felt like a taunt, daring her to return. And as much as she hated to admit it, she knew she couldn't ignore the call. For the first time since the nightmare began, Lydia felt a grim sense of purpose. The static wasn't just noise, it was a message, and she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what waited for her in the shadows. Lydia's return to the factory felt inevitable. Each passing hour since her last visit had only fueled the unease in her stomach, the feeling that something was drawing her back. Not out of choice, but out of necessity. The whispers, the static, the unrelenting sense that someone or something was watching her had become a part of her reality. And now, after the eerie message encoded in the static, the urge to uncover the truth had surpassed all of her fear. Claire had protested, begging her to stay, to let the mystery go. But Lydia had made her decision, and it was one that had come with an unsettling clarity. She couldn't keep running. She wasn't sure what was waiting for her at the factory, but she knew she had to face it. There was no other way. The drive was long, and the once familiar roads now seemed foreign. The factory loomed ahead, its silhouette dark against the setting sun. A strange fog had begun to settle over the area, as if nature itself was in on the secret Lydia was desperate to uncover. The air was thick, and as she parked her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath her was pulsing with something unseen. Lydia stepped out of the car, her breath shallow, and glanced around the abandoned site. The factory looked just as it had the last time she was there, decaying, forgotten by the world. Yet everything felt different now. The stillness in the air was oppressive, like a quiet before a storm. She clutched her flashlight and microphone, the weight of them grounding her, even as her mind raced with questions. What was it about this place? What had it all meant? As she approached the entrance, the door creaked open on its own, an ominous welcome. Lydia hesitated but entered anyway, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The factory, once alive with industry, now stood silent, its machinery frozen in time. But there was something about the silence, something wrong. It felt too perfect, too still. She turned on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, and began her search. Her eyes darted over the walls, the floor, the remnants of discarded tools and equipment. It was a labyrinth of broken machinery and abandoned spaces, but Lydia felt drawn to the back of the factory, where the sounds of the static had been most intense in the recordings. As she made her way deeper into the building, the whispers began again. At first, they were faint, barely perceptible, like the breeze brushing through a cracked window. But as she moved further into the factory, they grew louder, more distinct. They were no longer a murmur in the background, but a pressing voice that seemed to come from every direction, urging her forward. Closer, closer. Her heart began to race. She wasn't alone. Something was here. She wasn't sure if it was a person or something else, something darker, more intangible. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as the voices seemed to echo off the walls, whispering incoherent words, blending into a maddening cacophony of sound. It was the same static she had heard before, only now it felt more personal, as though it was speaking directly to her. Then, just as she rounded a corner, the whispers stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was more deafening than anything Lydia had ever experienced. For a moment, she stood frozen, trying to adjust her senses to the sudden stillness. Her flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. It was then that she saw it. A figure in the distance, barely visible in the dark, but unmistakable. A shadowy form, tall and still, standing at the end of a hallway. Lydia froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a person, if it was even a person at all. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if it were waiting for her. Lydia took a tentative step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to know who or what it was. As she moved closer, the figure began to dissipate, fading into the shadows as though it had never been there. But there was something else, something colder than the darkness itself. A feeling that clawed at her from the inside out, urging her to turn back, to leave this place before it was too late. But Lydia was already too far gone. She couldn't turn back now, not when she was so close. The floor beneath her feet creaked loudly as she continued deeper into the factory, each step echoing in the eerie silence. She didn't know what she was looking for or what she would find, but something deep inside her told her she was getting closer, closer to the truth, closer to understanding why the factory, the whispers, and the static had all led her here. And then, just as she reached the back of the factory, she saw it. A door, slightly ajar, leading into a room bathed in dim, flickering light. Lydia approached, her pulse quickening, unsure of what awaited her behind that door. But the whispers were gone now, replaced by a growing sense of dread. It was almost as if the factory itself was holding its breath, waiting. She pushed the door open. Lydia stepped through the threshold, the door creaking loudly as it swung open. The room was smaller than the factory floor, its walls lined with old machinery and forgotten equipment. Yet there was something disturbingly pristine about it. It wasn't the neglect she had seen in the rest of the factory, where dust had settled like a shroud over everything. This room was too clean, too well-maintained. The air was dense, heavy with a sense of anticipation. Lydia's flashlight flickered again as she cast it across the space, illuminating the shadows in awkward, fragmented angles. In the far corner of the room, there was a large old console, almost like something out of a science fiction movie. Wires snaked from it, disappearing into the walls, some cracked and frayed, others newly connected. It hummed softly, almost imperceptibly, but the sound wasn't like the static she had heard on the recordings. This hum was rhythmic, like a heartbeat, pulsing in time with her own racing pulse. Lydia took a cautious step toward the console, her heart pounding in her chest. The closer she got, the more intense the feeling in her chest became, as if the machine was somehow connected to her own life force. Her breath hitched as she reached out to touch it, and for a moment, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, as though the room itself had held its breath, waiting for her next move. She ran her fingers along the surface of the console, tracing the cold metal, until she found a small button hidden in a crevice. Instinctively, she pressed it. The room seemed to come alive as the console whirred to life, and for the first time since entering, the hum shifted. It became louder, sharper, as if the machine was waking up from a long slumber. Suddenly, the walls of the room seemed to pulse with the same rhythm. Lydia backed away instinctively, her eyes wide in disbelief. The room around her began to change. The machinery around her began to shift, as if it were alive, bending and contorting with unnatural fluidity. The air grew thick, dense with something unidentifiable, and Lydia could almost taste the metallic tang of it on her tongue. The walls seemed to bend inward, the room warping as though the very fabric of reality was being pulled apart. She felt the familiar hum of the static in her bones, deep within her chest. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the room fell silent once again. The machinery stilled, the walls returned to their original form, and the air cleared. But the silence was not a relief. It was a vacuum. Lydia's heart still raced, and her mind whirred with questions. What had just happened? Was it some sort of mechanism designed to drive her mad? Or had she somehow triggered something much larger than herself? Lydia's fingers brushed the microphone in her pocket. She pulled it out and clicked it on. The small device hummed, but there was no static, no distortion. Just the raw silence that now filled the room. She hesitated, unsure whether the silence was a reprieve or an ominous sign of something far more sinister. The stillness felt unnatural, a vacuum pulling her in deeper. And then, without warning, the voice returned. The words came in a whisper at first, barely audible against the silence. "You shouldn't have come." Lydia froze, the cold fingers of fear crawling up her spine. The voice was no longer static. It was clear, distinct, and unmistakable. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a command, a warning. Lydia's mind raced, her thoughts spiraling. Was this the voice from the recordings? Was this the entity behind everything that had happened? She raised the microphone to her lips, her fingers trembling as she spoke into it. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. The room seemed to respond. The walls pulsed once again with that rhythmic, mechanical hum. The air seemed to thicken, and the voice spoke again, clearer now. "You know who I am. You've always known." Lydia's blood ran cold. She couldn't place it. There was something eerily familiar about the voice, but it was too much for her mind to process. The longer she stood there, the more suffocating the room became. It was as if she were being drawn into a web, each thread tightening around her with every second. Her hand clenched around the microphone, and she knew deep down, that the answers she sought were in this room. The factory had never been just a factory. It had never been abandoned. This was the heart of the static, the source of it all. And somehow, Lydia had stumbled into it, and now there was no turning back. Lydia's breath quickened. She took a step back, eyes scanning the walls for some clue, some hidden answer. The hum was growing louder again, almost deafening. The pressure was building in the room, like the weight of all the silence that had accumulated over the years was collapsing in on her. She didn't know what to do, where to go next. All she knew was that she couldn't leave yet, not until she understood who, or what, was behind the voice. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides. But as the hum reached its peak, the console flickered, and in the moment before everything went silent again, Lydia understood. This wasn't just a recording. The factory wasn't just a place. It was a trap, a conduit for something far darker, something that had been feeding off the static, the whispers, and the fear. And now it was feeding off her. Lydia stood motionless in the now silent room, her heart pounding in her chest, each beat louder than the last. The unsettling hum had ceased, but the atmosphere remained thick with a sense of impending doom. The walls around her seemed to press in, their once solid presence now transformed into something fluid, something alive. Lydia's breath caught in her throat as she tried to make sense of the voice, the words that had echoed through the factory's eerie chambers. You've always known. The silence that followed felt heavier than the hum. Lydia couldn't move, couldn't think clearly. The air around her was dense, like she was submerged underwater. The room was no longer just a room. It was a living, breathing entity, and she had somehow awakened it. She could feel it, the weight of its consciousness bearing down on her, and her mind raced through every possible explanation. Was this all part of the podcast script? Had someone orchestrated this nightmare to torment her? But no, something about it felt too real, too visceral. Lydia's fingers gripped the microphone tighter. Her thoughts were erratic, disjointed, but one thing was certain. She needed answers. She had started this journey in search of a story, but now she realized she had stumbled into something far greater, far more dangerous than anything she could have imagined. The factory wasn't just a setting. It was the heart of something that had been hidden in plain sight, concealed beneath the layers of static and distortion. And she was beginning to understand that it wasn't just her story. It was the story of everything that had happened here. She turned away from the console and moved to the center of the room, her mind a swirl of confusion. You've always known. The voice had been so clear, so direct. There had been no hesitation, no distortion. It had been as if it had been waiting for her to arrive, waiting for her to make the connection. Lydia's eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that could explain what she had just experienced. Her flashlight flickered again, casting strange shadows across the walls. The beam of light landed on something peculiar, on a series of old photographs pinned to the wall, yellowed with age. They were blurry, indistinct, but there was something unsettling about them. They seemed to have been placed with purpose, each photo capturing moments frozen in time. Lydia stepped closer, her pulse quickening, and as the light settled on one of the pictures, her blood ran cold. It was a photo of the factory, taken from an angle she recognized. But the strange thing was that the workers in the image were not human, or at least they didn't appear to be. Their faces were obscured, their features blurred, as if the photo itself was struggling to capture their true forms. Lydia's hand trembled as she ran her fingers over the edges of the photo, her mind reeling. Had she seen something like this before? The sensation was familiar, like a fragment of a forgotten memory, slipping through her fingers. She tore her eyes away from the photo, heart pounding, and turned back toward the console. The static in her mind grew louder, a distant echo reverberating through the walls. She was no longer sure if it was the machine or her own thoughts distorting the air. The truth, whatever it was, felt just out of reach, like a shadow in the corner of her vision, always just beyond her grasp. Suddenly, the room seemed to warp again. The walls rippled, the floor shifting beneath her feet, as if the entire structure was shifting, bending, warping into something new. The cold air turned warmer, heavier, and Lydia staggered back, trying to regain her balance. Her hand shot out to steady herself against the console, but as her fingers touched the cold metal, a surge of energy coursed through her, an electric jolt that made her entire body seize. In an instant, everything changed. The console flickered to life once more, the hum returning louder than ever before. But this time, it wasn't just a hum, it was a voice. A chorus of voices, distorted and fragmented, all speaking in unison. The words were unintelligible at first, a mass of sound and static, but as Lydia strained to listen, the words began to coalesce. The story is not yours to tell. Lydia's chest tightened, her head spinning as the realization hit her like a blow. This wasn't just about a podcast. It wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about something far more sinister. She had unknowingly become part of the story, part of the machinery that had been set into motion long before she had ever stepped foot in this place. She wasn't just a witness. She was a player. Her hands shook as she gripped the microphone once more, pressing it to her lips. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice barely audible over the chaotic static. The voices on the other end seemed to pause for a moment, as if considering her question. Then the voice returned, cold and distant. "You have no idea." The room seemed to close in on Lydia, the air thick with malevolent intent. She backed away from the console, her mind racing as she tried to comprehend the enormity of what was happening. The factory had been designed to trap, to ensnare. But why? What was its purpose? And what did it want from her? Lydia's mind was a labyrinth of questions, each one more pressing than the last. She had come here seeking a story, seeking the truth, but now she was entangled in something far darker. The factory, the voices, the static, none of it was accidental. It had been waiting for her, watching her every move, and now that she had crossed the threshold, there was no turning back. The truth was no longer something she could control. It was something that was unfolding around her, wrapping her in its tendrils, tightening with each passing second. Lydia had to find a way out, but more than that, she had to understand what she had become part of. The static was alive now, pulsing through her veins, and she feared that if she didn't uncover the truth soon, she would lose herself entirely. Lydia's breath was shallow as she stumbled backward, her pulse racing. The factory's walls seemed to pulse with a dark, rhythmic energy, a thumping sound that matched the erratic beat of her heart. Each step she took felt like she was walking further away from reality, deeper into a labyrinth of confusion and dread. The echoing voices, the whispering static, it was all a part of something much bigger than she had ever imagined. A part of a story that was not hers to uncover. Yet here she was, tethered to it by an invisible thread. She stood there, frozen, surrounded by the hum of machinery and the deafening whispers of the unseen. Her mind was reeling from the revelation of her own entanglement in this twisted narrative. She had always believed that she was in control. This was her podcast, her story, her investigation. But now it was clear, the factory had its own will. It had been pulling the strings long before Lydia had even set foot inside. She wasn't a storyteller here. She was a pawn. Lydia's hands trembled as she reached for her phone, desperate to connect with the outside world. Maybe she could call for help. Maybe the authorities could do something. But as she unlocked her phone, a cold shiver ran down her spine. The screen flickered once, then went black. She tried again, but it was useless. The factory had swallowed her connection to everything. Panic began to claw at her mind, and she was forced to fight against the rising tide of fear. Lydia had to stay focused. She couldn't afford to lose herself to the terror that threatened to consume her. She had to understand what was happening. What was this factory? Who or what had built it? And why was it so determined to keep its secrets buried? As her eyes scanned the room, Lydia noticed a strange symbol carved into the floor beneath her feet. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but as she stepped closer, the jagged edges of the marking became clearer. It was an ancient symbol, one she vaguely recognized from the folklore she had studied in the past. It was the symbol of a gate, something meant to guard an entrance to another world, a barrier between the known and the unknown. But this was no ordinary gate. This one felt different. It felt alive. Lydia's mind raced as she tried to recall everything she knew about the symbol. The legend spoke of gateways that connected realms, of places where the veil between worlds grew thin. These gateways were said to hold immense power, but also unimaginable danger. Those who sought them out were often lost forever, trapped between worlds, never to return. But Lydia couldn't help but wonder, could this factory be one of those gateways? Had it been constructed to serve as a conduit between the living and something far darker? A sudden, jarring noise broke her thoughts, a sharp crack like the sound of something being torn apart. She spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The factory seemed unchanged, its eerie silence pressing in around her once more. But Lydia knew better now. She had learned enough in her time here to understand that nothing in this place was as it seemed. There was something lurking beneath the surface, something waiting to reveal itself when the time was right. The more Lydia thought about it, the more certain she became. The factory wasn't just a structure. It was a manifestation, a creation born from the collective energy of something far greater than human imagination. It was a living thing, shaped by desires, by secrets, by people who had sought to control its power. But the factory had its own plans. It wasn't simply a place. It was a presence, a force that had been alive long before Lydia ever stepped foot inside. Lydia's fingers brushed over the symbol on the floor, and as she did, she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It wasn't just her imagination. The factory was aware of her, and somehow, it had been guiding her all along. Every step she had taken, every piece of information she had uncovered, had been carefully orchestrated to bring her to this point. She wasn't just an observer. She was a part of the story, a story that had been written long before she had arrived. The weight of this realization crushed her. She had thought she was seeking the truth, but now she understood. The truth had been pulling her in, leading her here. And now, there was no turning back. The factory was no longer a place she could escape from. It had woven itself into her mind, its secrets gnawing at her consciousness. The more she resisted, the more it would consume her. She wasn't just trapped in a factory. She was trapped in a story, a narrative that had been crafted for her, one she couldn't escape. Lydia's thoughts spiraled as the room seemed to close in on her. The walls, the machinery, the hum, they were all part of the same entity. The factory had been waiting for her, and now that she was here, it would not let her leave. She had always known this story would consume her, but she hadn't known how. She hadn't known that the truth would tear apart everything she thought she knew. As the darkness pressed in on her from all sides, Lydia knew one thing for certain. The factory had become a part of her. She was no longer an outsider. She was one of them, and this was just the beginning. The factory, despite its eerie aura, had always held a sense of history. Not the kind you read about in books or hear about in documentaries, but a history that seemed deeply personal, almost as if the walls themselves held memories. Lydia had felt it before, the subtle undercurrent of something ancient, something forgotten. But after what had happened in the previous chapter, those memories had become less subtle. The factory was now a living, breathing entity, and Lydia was no longer merely an observer. She was deeply entangled in its past, whether she wanted to be or not. Her mind raced as she tried to connect the dots. There were fragments of thoughts, glimpses of long-forgotten memories that flitted through her consciousness, but they always slipped away just before she could grasp them. The factory had been built decades ago, but its origin was obscured by layers of time and secrecy. Was it possible that there had been others before her? People who had sought the truth and never returned? The idea sent a shiver down her spine. Perhaps they, too, had been drawn here by forces beyond their understanding. Lydia felt a growing need to understand what had truly happened in this factory. She needed to know what secrets it had hidden for so long. If the factory had indeed been built as a gateway to something more sinister, then there must have been a catalyst, a moment when its true purpose was revealed. But as she wandered through the darkened corridors, nothing seemed to align. The factory had been repurposed over the years, its function twisted to serve different needs, but its origins remained elusive. It wasn't until Lydia stumbled upon a dusty, forgotten room at the back of the factory that the past began to make itself known. The room was small, hidden away behind layers of forgotten machinery. The air inside was thick, stale, as though it had not been disturbed in years. The walls were covered with strange symbols, ones she had never seen before. They weren't like the ones she had discovered earlier in the factory. These were more intricate, more elaborate, as though they had been drawn by someone with a deep understanding of the arcane. Lydia's fingers traced the symbols, feeling the faint warmth of the marks beneath her touch. The more she traced, the more a sense of familiarity overcame her. It was as if the symbols were calling to her, urging her to dig deeper, to uncover the hidden truths that had been buried for so long. Her breath quickened, and a strange compulsion overtook her. She needed to find out what they meant. She needed to understand their connection to the factory, to the story that had drawn her in. As Lydia continued to explore the room, she noticed something else. Old journals, stacked haphazardly on a wooden desk in the corner. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. With trembling hands, she picked up one of the journals and began to flip through it. The entries were strange, cryptic, written in a hurried hand. They spoke of dreams, vivid, disturbing dreams of a factory much like this one. The writer described seeing shadows move in the corners of their vision, whispers that didn't quite make sense, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. The further Lydia read, the more she realized that these were not the ramblings of a mad person. These were the notes of someone who had experienced the same strange pull to the factory that she had. The name that kept cropping up in the journals was Samuel Blackwood, a name that Lydia vaguely recognized from her research into the factory's history. Blackwood was one of the factory's original founders, and his name had been linked to a series of bizarre disappearances that occurred around the time the factory had first opened. But the entries in the journals suggested something more sinister. Samuel Blackwood had been obsessed with the idea of crossing boundaries, of reaching into realms beyond the physical world. He had spoken of unlocking the secrets of the human soul and using the factory as a means to connect with something greater than humanity itself. Lydia's heart pounded in her chest as she pieced together the story. Blackwood had been experimenting with something dark, and it seemed that his obsession had led to the creation of the gateway she had felt in the factory. But something had gone wrong. The gateway had been opened, but it had never been properly closed. And now, all these years later, Lydia was standing at its threshold, unwittingly continuing Blackwood's work. She was connected to the factory not by chance, but by design. The more Lydia thought about the journals, the more she realized that her own investigation was not merely about uncovering the factory's past. It was about confronting the forces that had been awakened by Samuel Blackwood's experiments. She wasn't just uncovering a story for her podcast. She was becoming a part of it. The factory had known she would come. It had been waiting for someone like her to stumble upon its hidden truths. And now that she had, there was no turning back. Her mind buzzed with questions. What had happened to Samuel Blackwood? Had he been consumed by the very forces he had tried to harness? Was his spirit still trapped within the factory, guiding her towards some unknown fate? And more importantly, what did the factory want from her? Why had it chosen her as the next in a long line of people who had sought the truth, only to be consumed by it? As Lydia closed the journal and placed it back on the desk, she knew that she was nearing the end of her investigation. But this wasn't the kind of ending she had envisioned. The factory had become more than a mystery. It had become a living nightmare. And no matter how much she tried to distance herself, it would follow her. The echoes of the past had caught up with her, and now they were all around her, waiting to claim their next victim. Lydia sat alone in the dusty, forgotten room at the back of the factory, the weight of Samuel Blackwood's journals pressing heavily on her mind. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the madness of the past, and now that energy was seeping into her, blending with her own thoughts. The deeper she dug into the history of the factory, the more she realized that it wasn't just a place of work. It was something far darker, something alive, driven by an ancient force that had never really left. It had simply been waiting. The sensation of being watched had intensified since her arrival. At first, It was just a vague unease, the kind of feeling you might get in a room full of strangers. But now, as she sat in the room, surrounded by the forgotten remnants of Blackwood's obsession, that sensation was unmistakable. It was no longer a feeling, it was a presence. Something was here with her, something that had been in the shadows of this factory long before she stepped foot inside. Lydia knew she had to get out, but she couldn't move. The pull of the factory was stronger than ever before, and it seemed to hold her in place with an invisible grip. She tried to breathe deeply, to push through the sense of impending doom, but the air felt thick, heavy, as though it were saturated with something unseen. Her eyes darted to the journal in her lap, to the words that now felt almost like a personal invitation, a map leading her toward an inevitable conclusion. Samuel Blackwood's words had been a warning, but also a call to something she couldn't ignore. The more she thought about his obsession with crossing boundaries, the more she wondered if he had succeeded. Had he opened the gateway to another realm? Had he glimpsed something beyond the veil of the physical world? Something so powerful that it refused to be locked away? And if so, what did it want with her? She had come here looking for answers, but it seemed that the factory had its own intentions. It wasn't just a structure. It was a living entity, feeding off her curiosity, pulling her deeper into its twisted embrace. Lydia's hand shook as she flipped through the journal again, but this time, something felt different. The symbols that Blackwood had drawn, symbols that had seemed like nonsense before, now made a kind of sense to her. They felt familiar, like fragments of a dream that had been slipping away, but now were coming into focus. Her mind raced as she pieced them together, but there was something unsettling about it. The more she understood, the more she felt like she was becoming part of the very thing she had been trying to escape. It wasn't just Blackwood who had been obsessed with these symbols. Others had come before her, and others would come after. They were all linked to the factory, connected to its history, to its cursed past. The factory had a way of luring people in, of drawing them closer until they became part of its story, part of its dark, twisted legacy. And Lydia was no exception. She had unwittingly become another pawn in its long-running game, a game that had been played by people like Blackwood, and before him, by others who had tried to uncover the same truths. The factory wasn't just a place. It was a force, one that fed off the desire for knowledge and the need to understand the unknown. And as Lydia sat there, she began to realize that her podcast, her investigation, had been the catalyst. She had been chosen. The factory had reached out to her, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. She had come here seeking answers, but now, it seemed, the answers had come for her. With a sudden jolt, Lydia stood up, her heart racing in her chest. She couldn't stay here any longer. The room was closing in on her, the walls pressing in with an invisible weight, and the air felt suffocating. She turned to leave, but as she reached for the door, a noise froze her in place. It was faint, a whispering sound that seemed to come from deep within the factory. The words were indistinguishable, but there was no mistaking the urgency in the voice. Someone or something was calling her. Lydia's legs trembled, but she couldn't move. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. She tried to push the door open, but it wouldn't budge. It was as though the factory itself was keeping her in this room, trapping her, preventing her from leaving. Panic gripped her chest, but at the same time, there was a strange pull, something in the back of her mind, something that told her to stay, to listen. The whispering wasn't just a noise. It was a message. She was meant to hear it. She stumbled backward, her breath quickening as the air in the room grew colder. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, to writhe, as if alive. Lydia's mind raced, but she couldn't focus. She was losing her grip on reality, slipping into a place where the boundaries between the physical and the supernatural were no longer clear. The whispering continued, louder now, and it felt like the factory was speaking directly to her. It wanted something from her, and it wasn't going to let her go until she understood what that was. Lydia's gaze locked onto the old machinery in the corner of the room. She had seen it earlier, but now it seemed different somehow. It wasn't just rusted metal. It was part of something bigger, something that connected her to the very heart of the factory. Without thinking, She moved toward it, her feet carrying her of their own accord, as if she were being guided by something unseen. As she reached out to touch the cold metal, she felt a surge of energy, a pulse, as though the factory itself had come alive, and with it, the full weight of Samuel Blackwood's dark legacy. And in that moment, Lydia understood. She hadn't been drawn to the factory by chance. She had been drawn because she was meant to be here. The factory was awakening, and so was she. Lydia's heartbeat echoed in her ears as she stared at the ancient machinery. It loomed before her like a forgotten god, its rusted metal gleaming in the dim light that barely filtered through the grime-covered windows. The whispering had stopped, but its presence lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. Her fingers hovered over the cold surface of the machine, drawn to it as though it were magnetized. She could feel the hum of its energy, faint yet undeniable, vibrating through her body, aligning with the strange sense of familiarity that had settled over her since her arrival. In the moments before she touched it, Lydia hesitated. There was a sudden awareness that this moment would define everything that had come before it, and everything that would come after. She could walk away, continue her investigation, even leave the factory entirely. But that option no longer seemed like a viable choice. The factory had already chosen her, and now there was no escaping the consequences of that decision. The truth, whatever it was, would reveal itself one way or another. And Lydia had always believed in the power of uncovering the truth. Her hand made contact with the machinery, and for a split second, the world around her seemed to blur. The walls of the factory seemed to stretch and contract, and the ground beneath her feet shifted. She felt as if she were standing on the edge of something vast, something ancient and unfathomable. A low groan reverberated through the building, and Lydia stumbled back, her mind racing to make sense of what was happening. She had always prided herself on being logical, on approaching the unknown with a healthy dose of skepticism. But logic was failing her now. The air grew colder, and the shadows that had once been so innocuous deepened. They no longer seemed like mere absences of light, but like sentient things, like living tendrils that stretched out from the corners of the room. Her eyes darted around the room, trying to make sense of the growing sense of dread that filled the space. She was not alone. Something was here with her. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for her to unlock its secrets. It was in that moment that she realized what she had done. She had crossed a line, crossed into something that couldn't be undone. There was no returning to the world she had known before. She had stepped into the heart of the factory, into its very essence. And now, as the machinery seemed to pulse with life, she could feel it, an energy that was not of this world, pulling her deeper into its orbit. The whispering returned, louder than before, but this time, it was not just a voice. It was many voices, layered together, speaking in unison, speaking to her. They weren't words. They were fragments of thoughts, disjointed and fragmented, as if something was trying to communicate with her through sheer intent rather than language. The feeling was almost suffocating, this desperate, hungry need to understand, to process, to connect. Lydia closed her eyes, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The voices were inside her now, swirling within her consciousness, pushing against the walls of her mind. She could hear the voice of Samuel Blackwood, distorted and warped by the centuries, but unmistakably his. It was frantic, broken, filled with a kind of madness that Lydia had only read about in his journals. He had known the factory's dark secrets, had known the terrible truth behind its existence. And now, she was hearing them firsthand. But Blackwood's voice was not the only one. There were others too, others who had come before her, whose fates had been sealed by their curiosity, by their willingness to seek out the unknown. Lydia opened her eyes, and the room seemed to shift once more. The machinery in front of her groaned again, louder this time, as if it were waking from a long slumber. The shadows lengthened, twisted, as if reacting to her presence. And in that moment, the factory itself seemed to breathe, drawing in a deep, rattling breath before releasing it in a slow, deliberate exhale. The air was thick with energy, with anticipation. And Lydia, in that instant, understood that she had done something irreversible. The factory was alive. It wasn't just a building. It was a living organism, a twisted creation bound by forces older than time. It had fed on the curiosity of those who sought its secrets, and now it was feeding on her. The whispering voices grew louder, their tones rising in unison, blending into a single, deafening roar. They filled her mind, clouding her thoughts, drowning out her sense of self. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, the noise stopped. The room fell silent, the machinery still, the shadows receding into the corners. Lydia gasped for breath, her head spinning, as if she had just surfaced from a deep underwater dive. She wasn't sure how much time had passed, minutes? Hours? It felt as though everything had shifted in that brief moment, as though time itself had warped. But there was something else, something more pressing than the confusion or the dizziness. Lydia looked down at her hands, expecting to see them trembling, but they were still, calm, almost unnervingly so. The machinery in front of her seemed dormant again, as though it had never moved. But she knew better. The factory had awoken, and now it was watching her. She had become part of its story, and there was no turning back. The realization hit her with a cold finality. The answers she had sought, the truth behind the factory's dark history, were no longer in her control. The factory had shaped her destiny, and its course was now set. She had uncovered its secrets, but those secrets were not meant to be known. And in knowing them, Lydia had become a part of something much larger than herself, something that transcended the boundaries of time, of reality. She was no longer just an investigator. She was part of the factory's legacy, bound to it in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The machinery hummed once more, a low, almost satisfied sound. Lydia turned, her legs unsteady beneath her as she made her way to the door. She had to leave, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the factory was already following her, watching her every step. The whispering voices were gone, but they had left something behind, a lingering presence, an imprint in her mind that she couldn't erase. As she stepped out of the room, the weight of the factory pressed down on her. She wasn't sure what had just happened or what was going to happen next. But one thing was clear: the factory had not finished with her yet. Lydia stood at the threshold of the factory's exit, her pulse still erratic, her mind swirling with questions she couldn't fully comprehend. The factory had changed in ways that defied logic, transforming from a crumbling relic of the past into something far more unsettling, alive in a way that she had never before encountered. She had uncovered the surface of its dark history, but there was something in its depths that still eluded her understanding. She felt as though she were on the edge of a precipice, teetering between the known and the unknowable. The outside world greeted her with its harsh, unfeeling normalcy. The rusting gates of the factory loomed behind her, yet they seemed a world away, almost as if they had been locked in time the moment she stepped through. The cold morning air bit at her skin, but Lydia was numb, her body unresponsive to the sensation. She had to shake herself, had to regain her bearings, but the factory's strange energy still clung to her, like a shadow that refused to leave. Her steps felt heavy as she walked through the overgrown grounds, the trees bending as if whispering secrets into the wind. The further she moved away from the factory, the more she felt the pull, like an invisible tether drawing her back, urging her to return. The factory had not finished with her, and she knew deep down that she could never truly escape its influence. The truth she had uncovered was a dangerous thing, and there was no going back from it. She had not imagined the intensity of what she had felt within the factory's walls. The machinery, the whispers, the sensation of time bending and stretching. Everything about that place was alien to her, and yet it felt familiar, as if it had always been a part of her. How could she explain it? How could she make sense of what had happened? Her mind, once sharp and methodical, now felt clouded. The answers were within her reach, but they eluded her, slipping further away the more she grasped at them. Lydia tried to reason with herself. She had always prided herself on being grounded, on approaching mysteries with skepticism and logic. But now, The rules she had once followed no longer seemed to apply. It was as though the very foundation of reality had been cracked open, and she was left standing on the edge, unsure of what lay beneath. There was no way to explain the sensations, the experiences she had just lived through, without sounding insane. How could she possibly convince anyone else of the horrors she had encountered? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the familiar noise cutting through the dissonant hum of her thoughts. She pulled it out, relieved for a momentary distraction, and saw that it was a message from her colleague, Michael. He had been working with her on this investigation, but she had not heard from him since she had gone into the factory. She quickly opened the message. "Lydia, where are you? I've been trying to reach you for hours. Something's happened. You need to come back. The podcast, it's different. It's changed." Lydia's stomach dropped. She had been so consumed by the factory, by everything that had happened inside those walls, that she hadn't even thought about the podcast. The podcast, the very thing that had brought her here in the first place, was part of this puzzle, but she had been so focused on the factory's past that she had ignored its present implications. The message was a warning, a call to attention, and she could feel the urgency in Michael's words. Whatever was happening to the factory was now spilling over into their podcast, and she was at the center of it all. She hesitated for a moment, standing there on the edge of the factory grounds, torn between the need to investigate the podcast's strange shift and her own overwhelming need to put distance between herself and the nightmare she had just experienced. But the pull of the mystery, the weight of the unknown, was stronger than her fear. She couldn't turn back now. Whatever had started in the factory was far from over. She had to return. The drive back to the studio was a blur. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind racing, her thoughts fractured and scattered. The factory seemed to loom behind her, an ever-present shadow that she couldn't escape, no matter how fast she drove. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the factory's influence had extended beyond its walls. It was infecting everything. Her, the podcast, even Michael. It was all connected, and she was inextricably bound to it. When she arrived at the studio, she was greeted by an unsettling silence. The hum of the equipment, usually comforting in its steadiness, now felt wrong, like the heartbeat of something sick. Michael was standing by the control panel, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the screens in front of him. He didn't look up when she entered. "Michael." Lydia's voice sounded too loud in the silence, and he slowly turned to face her. His expression was blank, his features hollow, as if the life had been drained from him. "You felt it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lydia didn't know what he meant at first, but the answer came to her with a sinking feeling in her chest. The change in the podcast, it wasn't just the content. It wasn't just the audio or the editing. The very essence of the show had changed. The once controlled recordings had become chaotic, unsettling, as if they were alive, as if the factory's energy had found its way into the airwaves themselves. Lydia stepped closer to the monitors, staring at the recordings. The voices. At first, they were just random noises, static bursts of distorted speech, but now, they were more than that. They were intelligible, but they weren't human. The voices were layered, fragmented, calling out in strange patterns, echoing from the depths of the factory. And among the distorted murmurs, Lydia could swear she heard a familiar whisper. "Lydia," the realization hit her with a jolt. The factory wasn't just a building. It wasn't just a source of history and mystery. It was something far more insidious. It was a parasite, feeding off their investigation, feeding off their curiosity, spreading its influence wherever they went. And it had already started to consume the podcast. "We need to stop," Michael said, his voice shaky. "This is bigger than we thought." But Lydia knew it was already too late. The unraveling had begun, and there was no escaping it now. The factory had claimed them both, and there was no telling where it would lead them next. Lydia's mind swirled with the implications of what she had just witnessed in the studio. The podcast, once a simple exploration of forgotten histories, had transformed into something unrecognizable, something dark. The distorted voices on the recording were no longer just whispers from the factory's past. They were something else entirely. They felt alive, insistent, as if they were reaching out to her. pulling at the edges of her consciousness. The factory's influence had breached the walls of the physical world, extending its tendrils into their very creation, the podcast. And worse, it had infected Michael. She turned to face him, his pale face still fixed on the monitor, his hands trembling ever so slightly. He hadn't spoken much since she arrived, and when he did, his words were disjointed, as if he were only partially present. It was as if he had already become a conduit for something else, something that wasn't truly him. His reflection in the darkened screen seemed to warp, flicker, like a mirror reflecting a version of himself that no longer existed. "What are we going to do, Michael?" Lydia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond immediately, his eyes still fixed on the blinking lights of the control panel. For a moment, Lydia considered leaving, walking out of the studio, and never returning to this cursed place. But the factory's pull was too strong. Even now, it whispered in the back of her mind, its beckoning louder than her fear. It had already sunk its claws into her, and she could feel it tightening its grip. "You heard it, didn't you?" Michael finally spoke, his voice hollow. "The voices on the podcast, they're getting worse. I don't think they're from the factory anymore. They're from somewhere else. Something else." Lydia tried to ignore the chill that crept up her spine at his words. Something else. The idea of external forces beyond the factory, forces that she couldn't understand or anticipate, felt almost too much to bear. She had always believed that everything had an explanation, that mysteries could be unraveled with time and reason. But this was something else entirely. "You're right," she replied, more to herself than to Michael. "This isn't just about the factory. It's bigger than that. We've unlocked something, Michael, and now it's spilling into everything we do." The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. Lydia felt suffocated by the knowledge that whatever had begun at the factory had already consumed their lives. The podcast had been a doorway, and now that doorway had become a rift, a crack in reality itself. She couldn't help but wonder, had they unknowingly opened a portal, an invitation to something dark, something malevolent that existed beyond the fabric of their understanding? Michael's gaze shifted, and he met her eyes for the first time since she had entered the room. His eyes were wide, almost panicked, like a man on the edge of losing himself. "Lydia, you have to understand, it's not just the voices anymore. It's everything. The factory, it's changing the world around us. People are changing. People who've listened to the podcast, people we've talked to, they're not the same. They've been marked." Lydia swallowed hard. She hadn't considered the consequences of their work on the podcast outside of the studio. There had been reports of strange occurrences from listeners. Unexplained power outages, nightmares, moments of disorientation. But Michael was right. These were not isolated incidents. Something was happening, and it was spiraling out of control. The factory's malignant presence was seeping into the world, altering reality itself, as if the podcast was a beacon drawing the darkness closer. "Marked?" Lydia asked, her voice trembling. "What do you mean, marked?" Michael hesitated, as though the truth was too much for him to bear. "There's a pattern," he finally said. "Every person who's been affected by the podcast, who's heard the voices, has started to lose time. Hours, sometimes days. They don't remember things. They don't know where they've been or what they've done. And then they start acting differently. Almost like they're not themselves anymore. Like something is taking them over." Lydia felt a lump form in her throat. The people who had listened to the podcast were becoming vessels for the same malevolent force that had claimed the factory. It wasn't just a place. It was a virus, infecting those who came into contact with it, spreading through the airwaves, leaving an indelible mark on anyone who ventured too close. "This isn't just about us, Michael," Lydia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've unleashed something that's going to consume everything. The factory, the podcast, they're connected. And if we don't stop it, if we don't figure out what's really happening, then we're all going to be swallowed by it." There was no answer. The silence in the room felt suffocating, almost unbearable. Michael didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. He was staring at the screen again, but now his expression was different. It was as though he were staring into the abyss, into the very heart of the darkness they had unleashed, and he couldn't look away. Lydia knew that they were standing at the precipice of something far more dangerous than either of them had realized. The factory had always been a symbol of forgotten history, a relic that haunted the edges of their minds. But now, it was a living entity, feeding on their curiosity, drawing them into its web of shadows. In the podcast, the very thing they had used to explore, it had become the bridge, the conduit through which the factory's influence spread. She turned to leave the studio, unable to stay any longer, but Michael's voice stopped her. "You don't understand," he said, his tone desperate. "It's not just a podcast anymore. It's everything. The factory, it's taking over the world." Lydia stopped, the weight of his words hitting her with full force. The factory was no longer contained within its crumbling walls. It had already seeped into the world, into the fabric of reality itself. And as she turned to face the empty room once more, she realized with a shuddering certainty that there was no going back. They had already crossed the point of no return. The factory was coming for them, and soon it would claim everything. The days following Lydia's realization felt like a haze, a thick fog that seemed to envelop everything in its path. The world outside the studio felt distant, unimportant, as if the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary had blurred into an indistinct line. The factory, the podcast, and the voices, they had all become one and the same, an overwhelming presence that loomed over her every thought. What had once been a small, obscure project had blossomed into something far more sinister, an entity far beyond their control. Lydia hadn't heard from Michael since their last conversation. He had become withdrawn, no longer the energetic, ambitious producer she had known. He spent most of his time staring blankly at the podcast equipment, sometimes muttering incoherently to himself. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was being consumed from the inside out by whatever had taken hold of him. The factory's malevolent influence was no longer confined to the airwaves. It had crossed into reality, into their lives. The world outside the studio seemed strangely different, as though it were somehow out of sync with what Lydia had known. People seemed disconnected, their movements mechanical, like puppets on strings. It wasn't until she stepped into the street and noticed the familiar storefronts, now closed, abandoned, that the weight of it truly sank in. The whole city felt empty, as though everyone who had once lived here had simply vanished. Her heart began to race. The air was thick with an inexplicable dread, as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to happen. She had seen the news reports, fragmented broadcasts and distorted images, snippets of people claiming they had seen strange figures in the streets, heard odd noises in their homes, or experienced days where time seemed to stretch unnaturally. But none of it seemed real, not until now. It wasn't just the podcast, and it wasn't just the factory. Something else, something unseen, was pulling the strings. As she walked through the empty streets, Lydia began to feel the oppressive weight of something watching her. It wasn't just paranoia, it was real. Every shadow seemed to move. Every corner held an unsettling sense of anticipation. She could almost hear the whispers, faint at first but growing louder, as though the world itself was speaking in a language she couldn't comprehend. The voices from the podcast had bled into the world, and now they had nowhere to go but into her mind. They were calling to her, beckoning her deeper into the dark, urging her to listen, to understand. Lydia's mind raced with the implications of what she was experiencing. The factory wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a forgotten relic from the past. It was a force, a consciousness that had been dormant for years, waiting for someone to awaken it. And she and Michael had awakened it. But now, it wasn't just the factory that was alive. It was the very world around her, the fabric of reality itself, that was starting to unravel. She reached the edge of the town, the familiar silhouette of the factory looming in the distance. It stood like a silent sentinel, watching, waiting. She could feel its presence even from here, as if it were calling her back to it. But she didn't want to go back. The idea of returning to the factory, of stepping back into that cursed place, filled her with a terror she couldn't explain. Yet, deep down, she knew it was inevitable. She had to go back, The answers, whatever they were, lay within the factory walls. As she turned to leave the street, a sudden cold breeze cut through her, sending a shiver down her spine. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. For the first time since all of this had started, she felt a presence behind her. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a shadow. It was something far worse, a force that couldn't be seen but could be felt. A hand, invisible yet tangible, resting on the back of her neck. Lydia spun around, her heart hammering in her chest, but there was no one there. The street was still empty, the silence broken only by the distant hum of traffic. She stood frozen, her mind racing as she tried to rationalize what had just happened. But there was no rational explanation. There never had been. The whispering voices surged again, louder this time, filling her ears with incomprehensible words. They were everywhere now, no longer confined to the podcast. They were in the wind, in the walls, in her own thoughts. It was as though the factory had spread its influence over everything. It wasn't just a place. It was a contagion, a virus that had infected the very world itself. She staggered back, struggling to breathe, and felt something inside her snap. The sheer weight of it all was too much to bear. She had always been someone who believed in the power of reason, someone who sought explanations for the unexplainable. But now, nothing made sense. The factory had never been just a building. It had always been a catalyst, a focal point for something far more malevolent. And now it was no longer confined to its physical location. It had seeped into the world, into the very air, and it was changing everything. As Lydia made her way back toward the studio, she realized something with growing horror. The world around her wasn't just shifting, it was collapsing. The voices, the whispers, the shadows, they were all part of a greater plan, a design that she could no longer understand. Whatever had been unleashed had already begun to remake reality in its own image, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The factory's influence had extended too far, and its grip on the world was tightening. When she reached the studio, Michael was waiting for her. His eyes were glassy, distant, as if he had already succumbed to whatever force had taken hold of him. He didn't speak as she entered the room. He just looked at her with a vacant stare, as though he no longer recognized her. Lydia knew then that it was too late. They had unleashed something that could never be contained, and now the world was being torn apart by forces beyond their comprehension. There was no escaping it, no running from it. The unseen hand that had been guiding their every move was now taking control, and there was nothing left to do but watch as the world around them fell apart. The studio was eerily quiet. The hum of the equipment, once familiar and comforting, now sounded like a low, sinister growl. Lydia sat at the desk, her hands shaking as she stared at the microphone in front of her. The cold, metallic surface seemed to reflect not just her image, but her thoughts, fragmented and disjointed. Michael sat beside her, his eyes vacant, distant, as if he were no longer present in the room with her. The factory had taken him, just as it had taken everything else. She was alone now, surrounded by the remnants of a world that had already begun to slip away. The whispers, those maddening voices that had once seemed so far off, were louder now. They weren't just in the studio, not just in the air. They were inside her, a constant barrage of incomprehensible sounds that gnawed at her consciousness. She could no longer tell where the voices ended and where her own thoughts began. There was no escape from the invasion, no way to silence the cacophony. The podcast, which had once seemed like a small escape, had now become the conduit for something far greater, far more insidious. It had become the last bridge between the living and whatever lay beyond. Lydia's mind had been unraveling for days now, but today it felt different. The silence in the studio was suffocating. She could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her, as if the entire universe had turned its gaze upon her and waited for her to make a decision. She had reached the end of the line, and there was no turning back. She knew, deep down, that whatever happened next would be the end of everything. Whether it was the end of the world as she knew it or simply the end of her own existence, she could not say. It had all started with a curiosity, a fascination with the unknown. The factory had always been an enigma, a relic of a forgotten era, and they had pulled at its strings, unknowingly unleashing forces beyond their control. Now those forces were here in the studio with her. They were waiting for her to make the final broadcast, the final decision. And she understood, perhaps for the first time, that there was no running from this. The world was no longer a place of certainty and logic. It was something else now, something alien. Michael stirred beside her, his voice suddenly cutting through the silence. It was strange, distant, as if he were speaking from somewhere far away. "Lydia, it's time," he said, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. "Time to finish it. Finish it." The words echoed in her mind, bouncing off the walls of the studio, but they made no sense. What did he mean? Finish what? What had they started? The question seemed irrelevant, even absurd. Everything had already started. The factory had already begun its work, and nothing would stop it now. The world, as they had known it, was collapsing, but in its place, something new, something terrifying, was taking shape. Lydia turned her gaze back to the microphone. The equipment was still working, the blinking lights a constant reminder of the power they had once wielded. She could feel it, the pulse of the broadcast, the hum of the airwaves, the flow of something ancient and untapped. The voices were louder now, more insistent. It was as if the factory itself were speaking through the static, urging her to take the final step, to broadcast the last transmission, to allow the world to hear what was coming. She hesitated. She had always been someone who sought understanding, someone who wanted to make sense of things. But there was no understanding here. There was no clarity, no explanation, just darkness, just the void. And yet, as she sat there, staring at the microphone, she knew what had to be done. There was no escaping it, no way to fix what had been broken. This final broadcast was the last piece in the puzzle. It would be the bridge between the past and whatever future remained. Lydia placed her hand on the microphone. She could feel the vibrations in the air, the electricity running through the cables, as if it were alive, as if it were part of something much larger. The whispers, the voices, they were in the air now, in the very space around her, in the wires that connected the studio to the outside world. She took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the controls. The moment was here, the moment they had been working toward, or perhaps running from, for so long. With a sudden motion, she flipped the switch. The room was filled with static, a deafening roar that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. The whispers became screams, the voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony that vibrated in her skull. The studio lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and warp, as if the very air around her was bending. Lydia's heart pounded in her chest. It was happening. It had begun. For a moment, everything stopped. The static ceased, and a profound silence fell over the room. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the silence of something waiting. Lydia's skin prickled, every sense heightened. She knew, instinctively, that the world outside had changed. The podcast, the factory, everything had converged. There was no longer a distinction between the studio and the outside world. The broadcast had become a ritual, and the ritual had awakened something. Lydia looked at Michael. His eyes were wide, his mouth moving in silent words. He had become a part of this, just as she had. She could see now, truly see, the consequences of their actions. The factory had not just been a location. It had been a catalyst, an anchor for something ancient and unfathomable. And they had opened the door. And now it was too late. There was no turning back from the broadcast. The world was no longer the same. It had been reshaped, remade, and now it lay at the mercy of the force they had unleashed. But Lydia understood something profound in that moment. It wasn't just about the end, it was about the beginning. The world they had known was gone, but in its place, something else would rise. Something that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. The broadcast was only the start, and Lydia, for the first time in her life, had truly become part of the story of the end and the beginning